craved power at any cost. At one point, he was the single most powerful leader in Europe. He wanted to be the modern-day Julius Caesar of Rome, waving his hand in his own signature style. Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, name one person who wasn't a fan of his back then. His admirers would kill opponents at a mere signal from him, and then hang them in the public square. But time turned the tables, and eventually, he was the one hanged upside down in that very same square. Today, I will show you the story of a Mussolini. When Mussolini was in school, he would actually stab other kids with knives. He was a bully, which is why he got expelled from every other school he attended. But when he grew up, this stubborn boy, who used to be disliked by everyone, developed a strange attractiveness. It was due to his impressive personality and his confidence during discussions. This tall, strong man had a great charm in the way he spoke. He would become the center of attention at every gathering. But he was captivated by the personality of Karl Marx. You can gauge just how influenced he was by Karl Marx by this fact. When he went from Italy to Switzerland looking for work, he was absolutely penniless. But the only thing he carried with him was a picture of Karl Marx. For the first few months in Switzerland, he worked odd jobs. Then, he landed a job in a trade union. His role was to spread propaganda in favor of the unions. Mussolini was an avid reader and a smooth talker, so his propaganda became popular. However, the Swiss government didn't appreciate this. Mussolini was arrested when Switzerland launched a crackdown on socialists. And then, as it always happens, he gained even more popularity after his arrest. Even in his native Italy, he received immense publicity in the media. After being released from prison, Mussolini returned to Italy and became a schoolmaster. But since he couldn't be a good student, he failed to become a good teacher, too. So he quit the job and turned back to trade unions. However, by then, Italy was facing the same problem as Switzerland. The government wasn't happy with the trade unions, so he was thrown behind bars again. In 1909, when he was freed for a while, he fell in love with the 16-year-old daughter of his father's former lover. Mussolini's love affair was successful, and the two became partners for life. Mussolini was a well-known writer for communist newspapers. But in 1912, he launched his own newspaper, La Lotta di Classe. It means class struggle. This newspaper became so popular that the socialists made him the editor of another paper, Avanti. It means forward or progressive. Mussolini was such a prolific editor that he doubled Avanti's circulation in no time. Now, he had become not just an editor, but an active member of the Socialist Party. Mussolini was well on his way to becoming a great revolutionary. But in the meantime, the First World War broke out, and Mussolini saw a new way to fulfill his ambitions. Socialists were against the war. So, initially, Mussolini strongly opposed it, too. But when he saw the rich sectors of the country investing in the war, he started supporting it. His socialist colleagues opposed him, reminding him they were anti-war. In response, Mussolini quoted a sentence from Karl Marx to them: "Revolution comes only after war." However, the socialist class wasn't satisfied with Mussolini's answer. Mussolini was stripped of his editorship and expelled from the party. This was the moment Mussolini developed a deep hatred for socialists. Perhaps he didn't need them anymore, as he had found capitalist allies to support the war effort. These were the capitalists making money during the war by selling arms and supplies. Now, Mussolini did two things. First, he spoke to arouse a war craze among the people. Second, he equipped himself with arms and headed to the battlefield. When the war ended, Italy and the Allies had won. When Mussolini returned from the front lines, he was received like a conqueror. Now, his stature was much higher. After the World War, Italy had grievances against its allies, France and Great Britain. Basically, Italy got a very small share of the conquered territories. They were given Austria and a small part of Jordan. Most of the territories grabbed from the Ottoman Empire, such as Syria, Iraq, and others, were split between France and Britain. The great financial crisis that arose during the war also became a disaster for Italy. Mussolini took advantage of this economic crisis. Instead of talking about the suffering and crises caused by war, he began playing politics with the economic situation. He played a dangerous game, inciting people to rebel against the system just to gain personal fame. He said Italy needed a dictator to restore its prestige in the world, because, according to him, the current system had disgraced Italy. The fact was, Mussolini had played a full part in the war that led Italy to this state. However, his charm and charismatic personality turned a small, passionate group into staunch supporters. He spoke of the superiority of Italian nationalism, and these words touched the hearts of his admirers. A year after the war, in 1919, more than 200 ex-soldiers and political activists gathered in Milan, Italy. They formed a political party based on Mussolini's philosophy and made Mussolini their leader. Mussolini named this party the Fascist Party, which symbolized a bundle of rods. He named it this because he saw it as a group of fighters who would bring about a revolution. The name corresponded with the party symbol, a bundle of rods with an X. The Fascist Party was divided into political fascists and military fascists. The militant fascists, because they wore black shirts, became known across Europe as the Black Shirts. Mussolini had founded his party, but it still lacked one thing. It was a nationalist party that needed a rival to increase its power, someone to blame for all the problems, to fuel public hatred, and then use that hatred when needed. Luck favored Mussolini. He didn't have to look too hard to find a rival. His old love, Karl Marx, and the ideology of socialism was right there in front of him. At the time, socialists in Italy were holding demonstrations and strikes for their rights, bringing factory work to a standstill. Mussolini held the socialists responsible for Italy's problems, claiming their strikes were halting progress. Fascists soon waged open war against socialist groups. Trade union offices were set on fire, and hundreds of socialists were killed. The government was a silent spectator in all this catastrophe. Why? Because the government itself was fed up with the working-class strikes. Inwardly, the government was happy that an organization had volunteered to do its dirty work for them. But the fascists didn't know that the fight against socialism was just the trailer. The real movie was yet to start. As a matter of fact, Mussolini was preparing to take over all of Italy. His speeches testified to his desire to be Julius Caesar, the great emperor of the Roman Empire. Thus, naively or ignorantly, the government shot itself in the foot by giving Mussolini an opportunity. Mussolini's armed wing, the Black Shirts, began occupying cities. By 1920, most of Italy was virtually under fascist control, and the government's writ was nowhere to be found. 2 years later, Mussolini gave the government an ultimatum: step down and hand power over to him. Otherwise, his supporters would march on Rome and seize power by force. This declaration was essentially a threat of invasion and occupation of Italy's capital. On October 28, 1922, thousands of armed fascist party workers, the Black Shirts, gathered outside Rome. They were waiting for a call from their leader, who was actually waiting for someone else at his headquarters in Milan. And then, the telegram he had been waiting for finally arrived. Mussolini was overjoyed after reading it, because he no longer needed to march on Rome. Italy's army answered to the king, not the prime minister, and King Emmanuel III wrote that Mussolini would be made prime minister if he called off the march on Rome. Mussolini arrived in Rome, well-dressed, met the king, and took over as prime minister. He also stipulated that he would hold dictator-like powers for 1 year. The fascist party had become a full-blown army, and the king was helpless. So he accepted all the conditions. After becoming a dictator, Mussolini formed his cabinet, which included a majority of new workers from his party, many of whom weren't even original members. Just look at the shades of politics. The fruit at the destination went to those who didn't even make the journey. Mussolini openly rigged the parliamentary elections in 1924 and forced his candidates into office. With a majority in parliament, it was easy for him to change the laws, making himself a permanent dictator, not just for 1 year. The biggest problem for Mussolini was his fiery speeches from the past. Since he presented himself as the solution to every problem in Italy, he had to deliver. Now, as a ruler, he realized that if he didn't fulfill his promises, Italy would soon get sick of him. So, he focused all his attention on establishing peace and development. He also presented himself as a religious man to gain public support. To prove his devotion, he took many actions. One was recognizing Vatican City, the center of Christianity near Rome, as an independent state. Since then, Vatican City has been known as the smallest country in the world. Along with showing his religious devotion, he also punished his opponents. He banned the media and trade unions and arrested socialist activists. When Mussolini became the ruler of Italy, the world was passing through a critical phase. A communist revolution had taken place in Soviet Russia, which was an extreme form of socialism. Therefore, European powers and the US were looking for allies to help them crush socialism. This might be the reason Mussolini's rise to power was warmly welcomed by Western powers. The spiritual leader of Christians, Pope Pius XI, even declared Mussolini a man sent by Providence. British politician Winston Churchill, who later became Prime Minister, called Mussolini the greatest living lawgiver. Roosevelt, upon becoming the American president, termed Mussolini a representative of world peace and a great ally. Mussolini's admirers included not only Churchill and Roosevelt, but also a young German ex-soldier who wanted to follow in Mussolini's footsteps. His name was Adolf Hitler. Hitler took advantage of Mussolini's fascism to create an even more dangerous form, Nazism. According to him, the German nation was declared the best and superior to all others in the world. Hitler had great respect for Mussolini. When he took power in Germany in 1933, he maintained close ties with Mussolini's dictatorship. In return, Mussolini supported Hitler by stripping many Jews of their jobs, arresting them, and handing them over to Hitler. Mussolini considered Hitler an ally, but on a personal level. He didn't like him very much. When Hitler visited Italy in 1934, the two leaders were in a car, and Hitler asked Mussolini to give Austria to Germany. When Mussolini refused, Hitler got angry. Both men stepped out of the car with long faces. Later, when Mussolini was asked what the matter was, his reply was, "Hitler is nothing but a little crazy clown." However, after some time, Mussolini did give Austria to Germany, which improved the relationship between the two. Mussolini now began to think beyond Italy's borders. In 1935, with Hitler's help, he captured the African country of Ethiopia. A few years later, he also occupied Albania, a small country in Europe. On the other hand, Mussolini's friend Hitler was starting World War II with his radical ideas, and he was winning. His successes in Poland and France made Mussolini jealous. He didn't want Hitler to single-handedly take over all of Europe, so he jumped into World War II as well. First, he invaded Greece. The Greco-Italian War is one of the most interesting battles of World War II. You had a power like Italy on one side, and a weak country like Greece on the other. Mussolini generously offered Greek politicians and generals riches if they would just hand Greece over to him. Greece was weaker than Italy, but it couldn't be conquered by greed. When an angry Mussolini, crazed for victory, invaded, the Greek army gave him a crushing response. The Italian army was forced to flee. Not only that, but the Greek army chased the Italians back and pushed into Albania. Great Britain, an ally of Greece, also started destroying Italian ships. Now, Mussolini was quite perplexed and had to call for help from the very same friend he had once called a crazy little clown. When he asked for help, Hitler lectured Mussolini about invading Greece without consulting him first. Mussolini somehow managed to cool Hitler down and persuaded him to help. In 1941, the German army invaded Greece in aid of Mussolini, and in just 3 weeks, they conquered it and raised their flag. But the Greek defeat was the first crack in Mussolini's charismatic image. Now, the popular trust in him began to erode. As Mussolini's charisma began to dilute in his own country, rival forces gained power. Within 3 years, Mussolini's forces suffered crushing defeats in Somalia, Ethiopia, North Africa, and Russia. The straw that broke the camel's back was the American and British invasion of the Italian island of Sicily in 1943. And this time, the charismatic Mussolini could only stand by as a silent spectator. A meeting of the Fascist Grand Council was held to address this. The meeting decided to remove Mussolini from power to escape the hostility of America and Great Britain. So Mussolini was dismissed. Mussolini refused to accept the decision. He was a dictator in his own mind. He still believed the government belonged to him. So he ignored the party and council's decision and went to his office the next day. But the King of Italy had also turned against him, and the continuous defeats had weakened the black shirts. On the king's orders, Mussolini was arrested and imprisoned in a mountain area far from the capital. When news of Mussolini's arrest went public, the atmosphere of fear vanished instantly. People began tearing down statues of Mussolini and defacing his pictures across the country. In this situation, Mussolini's same crazy friend came to his rescue. Hitler sent commandos to free him and bring him to Munich, Germany. Hitler's army then occupied northern Italy and installed Mussolini as its ruler. The same Mussolini who, just yesterday, dreamed of establishing a Roman Empire and wanted to see himself as a conqueror like Julius Caesar, Augustus, and Constantine, was now just a puppet of Hitler. Reacting to this, Mussolini's former admirer Churchill said, "The position of Mussolini is now like a parasite or a slave of Hitler." Time passed, and the year 1945 arrived. Germany, which had initially proven to be the greatest player in World War II, was now fleeing the battlefield. Hitler's forces were retreating everywhere, and Mussolini, relying on Hitler's support, began to lose help. When Hitler's defeat became certain, Mussolini decided to flee Italy. The picture before you is said to be the last one of Mussolini alive. On April 26th, a convoy of German soldiers and civilians was heading to seek refuge in Switzerland, including an elderly couple. A 61-year-old soldier with a German Air Force helmet on his head and an overcoat on his body. The soldier was accompanied by a 33-year-old woman who appeared to be his daughter but was actually his lover. The next day, the convoy reached the lakeside town of Dongo, 25 kilometers from Switzerland, where an armed group of socialists stopped it. After the German defeat, the socialists were powerful again, and they were killing Mussolini's supporters one by one. They were desperately looking for Mussolini, as they had many scores to settle with him. When the convoy was searched, someone recognized this old German soldier. This old man was, in fact, Benito Mussolini, accompanied by his beloved Clara Petacci. She had sworn to stay with him until death. The socialists were frenzied over Mussolini's arrest. They imprisoned both of them in a farmhouse. When the sun rose the next day, the armed men took them to a nearby village. There, the couple was ordered to stand against a stone wall. Mussolini was convinced he would not be left alive, so he told the gun-wielding socialist soldier, "Be careful not to miss the target and shoot straight in the heart." It is said that Mussolini was quiet at the last moment and uttered no other words. This was the man who straightened the gun and shot Mussolini dead. The bodies of Mussolini, his mistress, and other fascists were brought back to Milan, the city he ruled only a few days prior. These bodies were thrown in the city square like garbage. It was the same city where Mussolini founded the Fascist Party. It was the city where Mussolini, with Hitler's help, formed his last government. In that same city and that same square, Mussolini had dumped the bodies of 13 socialist workers only 8 months earlier. Now, in that same square, the dead bodies of Mussolini and his associates were lying there, being watched and desecrated by millions of people. The bodies were even hung upside down and stoned. Some other supporters of Mussolini were also brought there, beaten, and hanged alongside him. Among them was one Achille Starace, who had once declared Mussolini a god. He was specifically brought before Mussolini's body and told, "Behold the end of your god." But Starace was so firm in his ideals that he did not fear death and paid a final salute to his dead leader. Then, he too was shot and hanged along with Mussolini. Mussolini's body was buried in a cemetery outside the city. But even in death, he became a problem for Italy. His opponents used to visit his grave to trample and desecrate it. On April 19, 1946, some of Mussolini's supporters dug up his grave and stole his body. They bathed the corpse and took it with them. They left a note on the grave saying they could not bear the desecration of their leader by the communists. They also wrote, "Our leader, You are with us now. We will cover you with roses. But the fragrance of your virtues will overpower even those roses. The government, upon learning about this, started a search for the body. After months, in August, the government recovered Mussolini's remains from a monastery in Milan. Years later, Adun Zoli became Prime Minister of Italy. He handed over the remains to Donna Rochelle, Mussolini's widow, to gain the support of right-wing politicians. In 1957, the remains were buried in the Mussolini family crypt in Romagna. A bust of Mussolini and party symbols were also installed on the grave. A black plaque now stands at the spot where Mussolini was shot. One of Mussolini's sons, Romano Mussolini, became a famous Italian jazz pianist and film producer. Mussolini's granddaughter, Alessandra Mussolini, has served as a member of the European Parliament. A portrait of Mussolini is installed in the Milan railway station, although someone has scratched the eyes out of the picture. Fascist ideology is considered unacceptable in the world today. However, a section of Italy still believes that Mussolini, the founder of the fascist party, was right. This group holds events at his grave and believes the return of Mussolini's ideals will bring back the greatness of Italy. Do you think Mussolini was a tyrant or a revolutionary who failed in his revolution? Do write in the comments. And if you want to know about Hitler, a fascist even bigger than Mussolini, wait for our next episode. Bye for now.